I've got a confession, folks, I'm a little bit biased when it comes to this comparison. Ever since Alina and I started this YouTube channel formerly called Drone Film Guide, our ethos has been to show you how to do more with less, how to make the most of the gear you've already got and not obsess about the latest and greatest kit. Now on the table I have the latest and greatest, the MAVIC 3, but I also have the second latest and second greatest, the MAVIC Air 2S, and this more than meets the minimum standard required to get outstanding aerial footage. So as I say, I'm biased. I'm going to need some serious convincing that this is worth the extra cash over this. Let's get into it now. Stewart here from Drone Film Guide, the channel where we learn to fly like filmmakers, one for old time's sake. Now, the reality is, it's irrelevant what my opinions are on this subject. At the end of the day, we all have different needs and wants, and we have different amounts of money in our pockets. So your priorities could be completely different from mine, and that's fine. So what I'm going to do here is give you some facts to help you inform your purchasing decisions. Speaking of which, grab yourself a copy of our drone comparison chart. It'll give you all the information that you need laid out in a nice chart format. And if you do have money burning a hole in your pocket, grab yourself a copy of our 8-hour drone cinematography masterclass. A little bit of investment in your education will pay off 100 times more than buying the latest and greatest gear. I can promise you that. We can't have this conversation without considering the price of these little beauties. Now, the Air 2S costs $999, the MAVIC 3 costs $2,199. If you go for the Fly More combos, the Air 2S costs $1,299 and the MAVIC 3 costs $2,999. In both cases, the Fly More combo brings the same benefits in the form of 2 extra batteries, a charging hub, some ND filters, and a nice bag. All I'll say on the subject of price, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, but if you look at the traditional camera market, every time you take a step up in terms of sensor size, things get a lot more expensive. And that's what we have on the table here, a 1-inch sensor and a 4/3 of an inch sensor. Things get a lot more expensive. This is nothing new. We've got a detailed camera analysis and picture comparison coming up, so we'll come to that in a second. But since we've got all the gear on the table, let's compare the hardware for a second. Now, certainly the offering from the MAVIC 3 is much bigger. As you can see, the drone itself is physically bigger. It's 895 grams versus 595 grams, and the package in its entirety is far more substantial. The fact that the MAVIC 3 is bigger means it can have a much bigger battery, giving a 46-minute flight time compared with the 31 minutes flight time from the Air 2S. Here in the European Union, the top speed of these drones is the same. It's restricted to 68.4 kilometers per hour to comply with regulations. Now, out with the European Union, you can fly the MAVIC 3 up to 75.6 kilometers per hour. It's not a huge difference. Now, what I will say is that the MAVIC 3 does have better characteristics in extremely windy conditions, but this is a relative concept. At the end of the day, the Air 2S is extremely robust nonetheless. But in extreme conditions, the MAVIC 3 will see you better off. In terms of transmission and range, both of these drones use the same RCN1 controller. We have OcuSync or O3 on the Air 2S and we have O3 Plus on the MAVIC 3. Now, theoretical range is 12 kilometers on the Air 2S and 15 kilometers on the MAVIC 3. I'm not going to be the one to test that. I don't care about that. What I care about is an indestructible signal when I'm 400 or 500 meters away, and both of these drones provide that. The MAVIC 3 definitely takes the win when it comes to obstacle avoidance. We have full omnidirectional obstacle avoidance here, unlike on the Air 2S where we have forwards and backwards sensors and upwards and downwards collision avoidance sensors. Both these drones have 8 gigabytes of internal storage, so that one's a draw. Before we talk about the 4/3 of an inch sensor primary camera on this drone, there's a secondary camera on this drone. The Air 2S only has 1 camera. Now, of course, the important question is it worthwhile and is it valuable? And on that one, I just want you to understand exactly what you're getting with this 7x zoom camera. Just to be clear, there's no overlap between the two cameras here. They don't share a sensor, so the secondary camera has a 1/2-inch sensor. At its widest field of view, it's a 24mm equivalent essentially, but the main functionality we have here is the 7x optical zoom, which is 162mm equivalent. Now, it's really cool, and it's a really nice image actually because it is an optical zoom, albeit on that 1/2-inch sensor platform. So we've got this really fun 7x optical zoom explore mode, as DJI calls it. The only thing is it has restricted functionality at the moment that I'm hoping will change with firmware updates. First up, there's no manual exposure controls, only automatic. Now, the Mavic 3 is a high-end, professional-grade drone at the end of the day. No one operating at that level wants to use automatic exposure, so I don't know what that one is all about. Second of all, in terms of resolution and frame rates, we're limited to 4K, which is fine, but at 30 frames per second. Now, there's no 24 or 25 frames per second. Finally, you need to understand how the zoom function works on this lens, because the notion of a 7x zoom would make you think that you have a smooth optical zoom from 1x all the way through to 7x, but you don't. You have your 1x optical zoom, so no zoom essentially, and then you have a 7x optical zoom. Everything in between, your 2x and your 4x, are digital zooms, and they don't really look that great because it's on a 1/2" sensor with an f/4.4 aperture. So in a nutshell, the only true optical zoom functionality of this lens is the 7x zoom. So last but not least, the main reason the Mavic 3 is so much more expensive than the Air 2S, the 4/3 of an inch CMOS sensor in that primary camera. We start from a fairly level playing field because both these cameras shoot 10-bit D-Log video. Here we have a 22mm field of view, which is slightly wider than the more typical 24mm field of view on the Mavic 3. The Air 2S has a fixed aperture of f2.8, whereas the Mavic 3 continues where the Mavic 2 Pro left off, with a variable aperture of f2.8 all the way up to f11. The Mavic 3 takes the win when it comes to resolution and frame rates. Now, the maximum resolution here is 5.12K by 2.7K. It's a slightly odd aspect ratio. It's not a true 16:9 aspect ratio, so you will get little black bars at the top and bottom that you can either conceal by way of a letterbox or just punch in slightly, but we do get frame rates all the way up to 50 frames per second. By contrast, the Air 2S actually gives us a little bit extra resolution with 5,472 pixels across the top and 3,078 down the side, which is a true 16:9 aspect ratio. However, the frame rates only go up to 30 frames per second. For your super slow motion needs, the Mavic 3 gives us 4K up to 120 frames per second, and the Air 2S gives us 4K up to 60 frames per second. Both of these drones take 20 megapixel raw photographs. Poring over specifications is one thing, but do we get any real-world benefits from the Mavic 3's bigger sensor versus the Air 2S? Look at these two identical images, the Mavic Air 2S on the left and the Mavic 3 on the right. Both are shot in 10-bit D-Log for maximum performance from the cameras. You can see straight away that the Mavic 3 is a flatter, more washed out picture, and indeed when you look at the waveforms, it confirms what our eye sees. Everything is a little bit more squashed in the middle of the waveform. The whites are not as bright and the blacks are not as crushed. They're pulled up more into the greys. This comparison shows the same results. Look at the black bag on the table on the Air 2S shot on the left. It's fairly black, whereas on the right hand side for the Mavic 3 footage, it's a kind of grey colour. One thing you need to be aware of is that just because one picture has less contrast and is flatter than the next picture, it doesn't automatically mean that it has more dynamic range captured as a consequence. Look at this shot of a sky with the sun in it. For the Mavic Air 2S on the left here, as we would expect, the sun is depicted on the waveform as this little flat line on 100 IRE. Everything's blown out. There's no extra detail to be retained in those pixels. There's nothing we can do with that, and that's what you'd expect to see. White is white, and it sits at 100 on the waveform. Now, by comparison with the Mavic 3, you can see that the sun is sitting down there on 85, give or take, but there's no extra detail retained. If there was extra detail, we'd see something of a parabola instead of some kind of flat line. It's just the same blown out sun, it's just it comes up a little bit grey. When we colour correct that, we're still going to have to shove those highlights up to 100, and it's going to be exactly the same result as the Air 2S. If we jump to the other end of the waveform and talk about shadows, then look at this comparison here. The Mavic 3 shadows on the right hand side are kind of grey compared with the darker, blacker shadows of the Air 2S on the left hand side. The only thing is, by giving us more washed out shadows at the time of capture, we can see a little bit more noise in those shadows. Now, the reality is we need to color correct this footage anyway to bring those blacks closer down to black. That's going to consolidate a lot of that noise, hide it in the shadows essentially, and ultimately we're going to end up with a very similar outcome to the Air 2S in terms of contrast. So in terms of dynamic range, I do think you need to squint a little bit to see any difference in terms of performance between these two drones, but the performance is outstanding. In the original review we did of this Mavic 3, we compared the image with the Panasonic GH5 that's filming me now. There's about £2,000 worth of camera filming me now. This is better than that, and the camera on this is this size. Absolutely outstanding. There's two areas where the Mavic 3 camera outshines the Air 2S. The first is in terms of low light performance, and the second is in terms of colour rendition. Bigger sensors are able to gather more light. It's as simple as that. And you can see in this example here that to get a similar-ish exposure, the MAVIC 3 was shooting on f5, whereas the MAVIC Air 2S was shooting on 2.8. As I said in the intro, when it comes to traditional cameras, people will pay a lot of money for improved low-light performance thanks to a bigger sensor. The MAVIC 3 camera was co-engineered with Hasselblad, so we have Hasselblad natural color solutions, a very strict criteria that the colors must meet. Now, it does sound a little bit like marketing waffle, I'm not going to lie, but if we do look at these two side-by-side examples staged here in the studio, they both look pretty horrid straight out the camera, but if we grade them, look at the difference there. I was definitely able to get a more natural look on the MAVIC 3 footage there on the right hand side. You can see that my t-shirt is a little bit less zingy. The same can be said for my right cheek or the left hand side of my face as you look at it. The cheekbone there is a little bit blown out and a little bit shiny there on the Air 2S footage. It's not on the MAVIC 3 footage. That was quite a lot of information, folks. What did you make of it all? Do grab yourself a copy of our drone comparison chart so you can see all the information laid out. Check out our 8-hour drone cinematography masterclass and do engage in the comments below. Share your thoughts. We always love to hear from you. Okay, until next time, happy flying.